The official negotiations in Washington between Donald Trump, Volodymyr Zelensky and European leaders have concluded. But there are already reports that both Zelensky and the European leaders are staying in Washington to continue the negotiations. But now in a completely different format. It has also become known that Trump has already called dictator Putin to tell him what was discussed today at the White House. And Putin agreed that a trilateral summit should be organized, but he says not between Putin, Zelensky and Trump, but between the Russian and Ukrainian delegations. It's still unclear if they will reach the leaders' level, but what is already clear and known is the leaks of information that Zelensky completely rejected the so-called peace agreement that dictator Putin tried to impose. No one is planning to leave Donbass. Ukraine will not agree to any territorial concessions, and in any format of negotiations there must first be a ceasefire, and only then any talks about the subject of that very peace agreement. Well, it also became known that Ukraine offered Donald Trump a sort of contract to purchase weapons worth $100 billion, which should become the first step towards providing those very security guarantees that the American president is promising us. So let's now sum up the initial results, the actual results of today's negotiations in Washington between Trump, Zelensky, and the European leaders. What was discussed, and what did they ultimately come to today, and how? This is related to the fact that Trump called Putin right after the negotiations and spoke with him for 40 minutes. And after that, he said that he had started preparing for a meeting between Putin and Zelensky at a location that still needs to be determined. Well, and Trump stated that a trilateral meeting will indeed take place with the participation of Putin, Zelensky, and himself as the American president. So, let's go through everything step by step now. My name is Alexei Peti. Today is already August 19th on our calendar. Before we begin, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, leave a like, write any comment, and be sure to subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pechai News. The link to it is in the description of this video. So, the negotiations in Washington have ended. They lasted quite a long time. Let me remind you, first it was a meeting between Zelensky and Trump, which lasted about an hour. Then it moved to a broader format with the participation of European leaders. Friedrich Merz, Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron, Alexander Stubb, and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen were present. And all of them were discussing the architecture of European security in the context of ending Russia's war against Ukraine. And right after the negotiations, the Financial Times, citing its sources, wrote that Ukraine offered Donald Trump a $100 billion arms deal in exchange for security guarantees. But within this article, there was a key paragraph that clarified everything. Quote, Ukraine will not accept any agreements that include territorial concessions to Russia and insists on a ceasefire as the first step toward a full peace agreement. And this, as you understand, is not just some diplomatic thing, it's a solid framework that President Zelensky is now leaving the White House with, of course, supported by Europe. And in addition, as you understand, such information leaks ruin the entire, let's say, narrative of a quick peace, the way Donald Trump wanted to achieve it, or rather what Putin whispered to him. In short, Zelensky played on Donald Trump's field, but set his own rules there. We are not going to give up a single inch of land. First a ceasefire, then any negotiations about the subject of a peace agreement. Security guarantees. These are not just words and pieces of paper. It's a clear mechanism, clear contracts, arms supplies, funding, support for the army, and so on. Well, judging by the Financial Times article, Zelensky's bet is not only political but also financial and military. This idea, as it has been called, is already above the $100 billion package. It's an attempt to convert future arms purchases and joint weapons production into real, legally binding security guarantees. Financial Times writes right in the headline of the article, Ukraine offers Trump a $100 billion arms deal. That is Kyiv is ready to secure this guarantee shield with money and contracts, not with some communiques, memorandums, or press announcements. Now, about the political nerve of this strategy. Financial Times in another article. Today, it already covered Zelensky's mission in the Oval Office. It wrote that his mission was to emphasize Ukraine's red line: Zelensky will not give Putin the territories that remain under Ukraine's control. That is, any land swaps that were discussed after Alaska after the Trump-Putin meeting are unacceptable to Kyiv by definition. Here's another fact from the Financial Times. At the Anchorage summit, Putin demanded full control of the rest of Donbass, Donetsk, and Luhansk regions in exchange for freezing the front line. For Ukraine, this is a huge disadvantage in defense, and unfortunately it can be said that it's an argument in favor of the future war resuming. That's why first there's talk of a ceasefire and then some broader framework for a peace agreement. What's on the other side of the table? So we have Ukraine on one side, and on the other side we have Donald Trump. And according to the Financial Times, the American side is playing the security guarantee card for Ukraine outside of NATO. As Trump stated, the United States will be involved in strengthening Kyiv's post-war defense. Trump, is suggesting the idea of a trilateral meeting with Putin and Zelensky. It all sounds like a bridge between a quick peace and long-term security, but a bridge without supports, as you understand, is just a decoration. That's why Kyiv insists on the issue of a ceasefire, that it should come first. Without a ceasefire, the Ukrainian delegation insists. Guarantees become rhetoric as negotiations occur amid artillery fire, in favor of the one who, has the longer barrel that day. Well, we understand that if Russia increases ammunition production, then it will have the longer barrel. That's why no one is going to move forward without a ceasefire. Zelensky made this clear today to both Europeans and Trump. Reuters completes the picture. The agency notes that Zelensky flew surrounded by Europeans. This is a deliberate attempt to close the corridor for a deal at someone else's expense. Reuters also describes the core of Moscow's demands: to transfer more territory of the Donetsk region to Russia in exchange for a freeze. Kyiv's response in the Reuters article can be summed up very directly. Negotiations, yes, but only from the current front lines and within the framework of the Constitution, where, of course, there are no gifts for the aggressor. This matches the Financial Times' stance: no territorial concessions or ceasefire as a first step. So, just to understand why the Ukrainian delegation led by Zelensky was so adamant today that a ceasefire must come first. To understand that this isn't just some whim, but rather a well-constructed mechanism, engineering. It's enough to look at the logic of today. The thing is, Trump, publicly, as they say, raised an eyebrow at the idea of a ceasefire before negotiations. It's not necessary. Trump said today that in general, to reach a peace agreement, it's not necessary to stop the fighting along the entire front line. He began saying this after meeting Putin. Earlier, he insisted a ceasefire must come first. For Ukraine, negotiations under fire are negotiations on, a slippery slope. Because while you're arguing about a comma in the text, about where it should be placed, the enemy is changing the positions of their batteries, testing the strength of Ukraine's air defense, and continues to shell peaceful Ukrainian cities. And this can go on for weeks or even months. While you're finalizing the draft of the peace agreement, should the comma go here or here? Of course, this doesn't work for Ukraine. That's why the formula of first a ceasefire, then a peace framework, is an idealism. It's not a whim. It's not just a wish. It's an attempt to put the negotiations on solid ground. And let's get back here to the $100 billion deal. What does this so-called super package mean in practice, as it's been called? Briefly, let me remind you, Zelensky proposed to Trump to make a trade deal, a $100 billion contract to buy American weapons. First of all, it turns those very security guarantees from a political mantra into a chain of contracts. Patriot air defense systems. It is stated that Ukraine is ready to purchase about 10 of them. Long-range missiles. We buy it, it's ours, we strike wherever we want. Ammunition, joint weapons production, service, and so on and so on. Secondly, this super weapons package sets up automation. That is, Contracts are written years in advance with triggers in case the ceasefire is violated. Thirdly, that very burden is distributed. The United States takes on part of it, Europe takes on part, and Ukraine also takes on some of the burden. Not just with words, but also with money, production, and logistics. Finally, it's a signal to Moscow that the world Putin wants to achieve will not stop the rearmament of Ukraine. On the contrary, a peace agreement in the end will simply cement that very rearmament of Ukraine. That's it. There's no turning back. And this super package of $100 billion secures that. This is actually part of those very security guarantees if you look at the situation like an adult. Not on paper, but in reality. And now the Financial Times puts this idea in the headline. It's not a coincidence, because this is Ukraine's first leverage in negotiations with the White House. And now the Financial Times writes that Ukraine insists on a ceasefire as the first step toward a full-fledged peace agreement. This matches the public logic of Zelensky, which the Associated Press summarizes today as a willingness for a trilateral meeting while maintaining the basic condition: territorial integrity and real security guarantees. In other words, Kyiv isn't leaving the room, Kyiv is just taking the knife off the table and warning that, sorry, if there is food, we'll use utensils, we'll act appropriately. Not the other way around. Let everything rage on, the war continues, we'll play around with commas, but there's no ceasefire, then the signing of some documents. And Europe, as we already discussed today, kind of echoes these words. Europe says borders can't be changed by force, no restrictions, the armed forces of Ukraine, there will be no demilitarization, and so on. Next, after Alaska. Trump really likes to repeat that Zelensky can end the war almost immediately. Indeed, yes, Zelensky can end the war almost immediately, but with one red line, almost immediately, yes. Only if there's a ceasefire first and no territorial exchanges. Continuing, and here comes the show, which, will be tearing apart in the coming days. Washington seeks a quick political moment. They need to quickly and elegantly announce that they finished another war, and Ukraine is looking for solid mechanisms. And solid mechanisms still need to be worked out. You can't meet Putin for 3 hours, then spend 3 more with Europeans and have Zelensky declare peace. No, it's a very complicated process, and everything needs to be worked out very thoroughly. That's why $100 billion isn't about the money, it's about speed. A contract is not a press release, it's production, it's deliveries, it's clearly specified dates. And in that case, the United States isn't promising us protection. No, they're shipping it according to a schedule with signatures for many years ahead. That's the deal Ukraine is agreeing to. And what if a ceasefire isn't the first step, and Trump insists that there shouldn't be any ceasefire at all? You just have to sit down and sign something. But then, any document will just turn into a pause for repairing the Russian war machine. And security guarantees turn into a set of vague words, general phrases that will simply drown, in the morning reports of Russian shelling. That's why the Financial Times stresses Ukraine will not accept a deal involving territorial concessions. Not only because of pride, but also because this destruction undermines the defensive geometry and legitimizes force as a method. On this point, the positions of the European Union and Ukraine coincide. No deals at the expense of territories. Lastly, regarding the political cost, if the White House tries to push through a deal without a ceasefire and with exchanges, let's put exchanges in quotes, of territories, it will face rejection from Ukraine and resistance from Europe, which is exactly what happened today. Reuters is already describing the so-called European cordon around the negotiations. Financial Times describes Zelenskyy's mission with a clear no on territories. Such a situation may not lead to the breakdown of peace, but rather a reset of the structure. That is, first of all, a ceasefire as a test of good faith. Putin, prove that you want peace. A ceasefire. Complete, total, unconditional. Then a legally well-defined security guarantee with long-term contracts and a clear automatic assistance process. What triggers it, how, and when. Within this framework, the deal can be shown to United States voters without risking Europe's security. In principle, it will suit everyone except maybe the unwashed Russians. And finally, I'll briefly summarize what was said today. This can be summed up in a brief conclusion describing the entire dynamic of the Washington negotiations. Ukraine will not accept any agreements involving territorial concessions, and Ukraine insists on a ceasefire. As for the first step by the United States, they pledged to help strengthen Ukraine's security after the war. And between these lines, there will be real bargaining, if you will, over positions. If a ceasefire becomes the first step, and United States involvement, the borders, the more on contraire, Melly. A measured agreement guaranteed us a long-term lasting peace with clear security guarantees. Interestingly, there were no press conferences after, meaning, and none of these meetings took place in Washington today. Obviously, they continue to negotiate further, and now Trump has already stated that he had a very good meeting with the distinguished guests, listing all of them. The meeting continued with negotiations. In the Oval Office, they discussed security guarantees for Ukraine, which could be provided by European countries in coordination with the United States. Then Trump writes, "Today, everyone and everything is very happy. The possibilities of peace, Russia and Ukraine." At the end of the evening, I called President Putin and began preparations for a meeting between Presidents Putin and Zelensky, the location of which will be determined later. After this meeting, the two presidents and I will have a trilateral meeting. This is a very good early step for a war that has been going on for almost 4 years. Let me remind you, 11 years. Vance, Rubio, Witkov, thank you for coordinating between Russia and Ukraine. Well, that is Trump. It's obvious that just as he wanted first organized a meeting with Putin, now with Zelensky, and now he dreams of organizing a three-way meeting. But I really doubt that Putin will agree to a bilateral meeting with Zelensky. I really doubt it. And Putin's side has already responded, saying yes, they didn't confirm a conversation with Trump, but they said they agreed to a meeting between the Ukrainian and Russian delegations. Delegations, meaning not Putin and Zelensky. Nevertheless, journalists from Axios are writing that they hope to hold a face-to-face meeting between Putin and Zelensky by the end of August. How successful this will be is still unclear, considering that the positions of the parties are completely different. I'll leave it at that. Friends, share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care. Goodbye.